my sister from across the pond. Now, we're having an American conversation, but I imagine it's a global conversation, right? And because whiteness is a political and social structure designed for to stay in power, right? It is a fairly new. You did a whole dissertation on the coming of whiteness, like when did whiteness come? So let's talk about that, because I think even so-called white people don't understand that they're part of a political assassination on Black folk. Like you're part of something, right? So break that down, Dr. Dabiri.
I would say it's a political. Actually, I would say it is a wholesale assassination on the world, not just restricted to even just an assassination on Black folk. So whiteness, we believe, we're taught that race is just what we are. It's just a biological truth. But when you actually study whiteness and Blackness, you come to see that the idea of white people, the notion that white people exist as a race, is so recent in human history. It's only it first appears in the 17th century, in the late 1600s. Before that, when people say, okay, there's been racism for millennia, that is emphatically untrue. The type of racism that exists today, anti-Blackness, white superiority, white supremacy, that type of racism has only existed since the 17th century,
Which coincides with the Portuguese heading to this continent and discovering gold, and there's all of this other, Black bodies. Wait a minute. We could let's put them in the holes of the ship along with the gold and all the other things that we're getting from this continent that has everything. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so then, it is. Sorry, go on.
No, I'm just saying there's a direct correlation between the transatlantic slave trade and this thing called whiteness.
There is a direct correlation. It is no coincidence that the idea of a white race existing, and from its earliest origins, enshrined into that notion of a white race, is this idea of alleged superiority. Whiteness is invented to enshrine a notion of white superiority and to justify Black subjugation. And it is no coincidence that it first is invented in the English colonial Caribbean. And there are two primary reasons why the notion is introduced and why it becomes codified into law. So what happens is it's introduced through a series of legislation, slave codes, that within these slave codes start to enshrine human rights for people who are racialized as white, while denying any recourse to rights or justice for people who become racialized as Black. And what it does is, so before there's the concept of whiteness, there are, of course, people who look different to each other. There are, of course, people from Europe. There are, of course, people from Africa. They have different complexions. They have different phenotypes. They have different hair textures. But the idea that those physical features have any intrinsic meaning or value is what is introduced with this idea of a white race. And it happens for two main reasons. And as I said, it's no coincidence that it happens in the colonial Caribbean in the 1600s. Two things are happening. Thousands, and at this stage, thousands, of course it becomes millions, but at this stage, thousands of Africans, are being kidnapped and forced to work on the plantations in these new colonies. The vast and obscene wealth is being generated. In order to justify the brutal exploitation of these people, a narrative is needed. What the idea of a white race and a Black race does is to create this natural order where white people, are the natural lords and masters of everything, and Blackness becomes associated with all of these inferior characteristics. And this justifies this is a form of dehumanization that justifies the enslavement that these economies are becoming so dependent on. But the other thing that it does, the other thing that's happening in that historical moment that is really interesting is specifically in Barbados, where we see it first, is first of all, we see these slave codes codes in Barbados. Then we see them in Jamaica, and then shortly after we see them in Virginia, before the United States exists, actually, in what will become the United States. And then from Virginia, they travel, they are copied in other parts of North America. But what the necessity is to justify the enslavement of Africans, Black people that will be known as Black people. But it's also because you're seeing in Barbados, in the early days of that colony, there were Irish indentured laborers. I make a point of saying indentured laborers because sometimes you hear this story that the Irish were slaves. The Irish were never slaves, but they were indentured laborers in the Caribbean. The Irish indentured laborers in the early days of the colony and the enslaved Africans in the very early days of the colony, before there's the notion of whiteness and Blackness existing, actually saw the English landlords as a shared enemy. There were a series of uprisings where indentured Irish and enslaved African came together and attacked the landlords. That was very, very threatening to the power structure. The second thing that the idea of race, whiteness and Blackness did, it dehumanized Black people, but it also prevented those coalitions from emerging that were happening between oppressed Europeans, indentured Irish and enslaved Africans, by creating this wedge, by creating the idea of race that prevented those type of coalitions from emerging. So the indentured Irish started to see their shared interests with other white people, even if they were white people who exploited them, you know?
We're talking with Dr. Emma Dabiri, who I could talk with forever. She's the author of Don't Touch My Hair, as well as What White People Can Do Next. And I find this, as infuriating as, Bob Johnson offering himself up as the first Black billionaire. This is in modern time. But everything that you're saying undermines, because Hannibal, if I'm remembering the Carthage, Hannibal and the Moors occupied Spain for how long? The Moors, the Black Moors, the Othello, those of you who are Shakespeare, they were in Europe, like colonizing, basically. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of miscegenation. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying, like, there's no pure race of people except the inbred British. Sorry. I said it out loud because they want to keep all of the wealth. They're like the Vatican, but they get to have. So anyway,
I have to say, Britain is also a mongrel nation. Do not believe the hype.
No, I know. I'm talking about the queens and kings. The monarchy, very inbred. But yeah, I'm not talking about the Brits as a whole. But where the power resides, Dr. Emma. I'm thinking about it defies logic to have whites and Blacks when Spain, Portuguese, Italy were all occupied by Black people at some point, and there was a whole lot of miscegenation. How do you even justify that? But that's not what I want to talk about. 866-801-8255. I find it fascinating to sit in this for a second, that this whole thing was constructed so that whites and Blacks, Irish, and you were born in Dublin, Ireland, by the way.
Yeah, so I'm Irish. I was born and raised in Ireland. My mom's Irish. As soon as I was born, I actually moved to Atlanta. So I spent the first few years of my life in the States. But we moved back to Ireland, which was a short, sharp shock. Ireland in the 80s, being one of the only Black people in the country. Honestly, there was like.
Did you direct them to the Black Madonna that they worship? There's a Black Madonna. I'm sorry.
I didn't know about her. But yeah, that's why the Irish history is, particularly interesting to me. But then also that tension between when you grow up in Ireland and the very strong kind of anti-imperial, anti-colonial sense that permeates the culture in Ireland. But then when you look at the history of Irish Americans, particularly, in the 1800s, from the 1840s, when the Irish are flooding into America, fleeing the famine, it's not a natural famine, it's a famine that is caused by British imperialism. Ireland was colonized for 800 years. So when you see that, when you have this moment where the Irish are flooding into the States, escaping the famine, you would imagine that there might be something of a natural sympathy between the Irish and Black Americans. But no, what you actually see is, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, a strong investment into whiteness and white supremacy from the Irish, to very much separate themselves from Black people and to enter the material spoils that are afforded by admission into whiteness. Because when the Irish turn up, they're not automatically perceived as white. They are perceived as other and lesser than. They do experience discrimination, but they really, invest in the project of whiteness to their own material gain. So I'm really interested in the States. So I'm interested in that tension between, being oppressor and oppressed that exists.
Well, that's classic, and it's why they became the patty rollers, which are now the police. Became an easy transition. But I'm always fascinated by who gathered the people to make the plan. Like somebody had to gather. We know that they're, right now there's Bilderberg. I probably shouldn't say that out loud, where they are planning for the next 50, 100 years of y'all's life. But and then they had a meeting, and they divvied up Africa, right? King Leopold got these people, the Afrikaners or whatever, the Dutch got South Africa, the Brits got
scramble for
Ghana.
Africa. Mm-hmm.
Right. They had a meeting though. We know that they had a meeting.
They had a meeting in Berlin. Yeah.
Right. Ironically. Hello, Nazis.
The Berlin Conference.
Yes. Who had the meeting to come up with whiteness? Like, can we pinpoint, like, when was that meeting had and who led it? Because that person should be immortalized right next to Hitler.
I don't know. I would imagine that when it was first so basically it's 1661 is the first time we see it written into law, and then the next time we see it in law, then in Maryland. Oh God, I always say this wrong. We always want to say Maryland, but I feel you guys say Maryland.
Maryland, yes, Maryland. Yes. But say it however you want to. We'll follow your lead. Sure. Made up names.
So you see whiteness written into law there in, again, the late 1600s, and it's actually to stop miscegenation, as it's called. And then the next time you see it is in Virginia through this series of slave codes. And I think what happens is these slave codes are introduced in different parts of the Americas, and somebody in another colony will be like, oh, they're working really well. That's a great idea. Why don't we introduce those slave codes here as well? These ones that like just completely ensure that the people who are racialized as Black, people of African descent, have no protection or rights under law. So I don't know if it starts off as a master plan. I think it happens in one place. It works really well and it's effective and it spreads. The idea spreads like wildfire. I say, like, as a meme, whiteness is like, unparalleled in terms of success.
You know what's crazy about that is
hi.
Hi.
Let me introduce Drew McCaskill, Dr. Emma Dabiri.
Dr. Dabiri, when you're talking, it makes me think about how history just repeats itself, right? Like, one of the things that I've always said is that one of the things that always has baffled me is poor white Republicans, right? Like, that people would be so invested in whiteness that they would vote against their own self-interest, right? Because they feel like whiteness is going to always be the air cover they need, regardless, even if it's not for them, for the next generation. Mm-hmm. But you also see exactly what you just said in terms of how, these anti-voting laws, they worked in Georgia. Let's take those exact same words and enter them to legislation in Texas and in Wisconsin and in these other places. When we think about how history repeats itself and this whole idea of whiteness is really just a rinse and repeat series of strategies, what are the strategies that you've seen as you're looking from, even if it's just from the anthropological lens, that where whiteness is upended or thwarted? Are there any places in history where you see it's clearly thwarted, that strategy is thwarted, so that we can replicate that?
So I think I've seen attempts maybe at doing that, but those attempts, will be thwarted. I think what you just said about it being rinse and repeat, that really highlights that's such a great example, and it really highlights the necessity of knowing history, so we can see, oh, this pattern is re-emerging. This is them doing that same old shit that they've been doing so successfully for centuries, And if you know the history, you have a greater understanding. You have a greater understanding of what it is that is happening. So I think you're better positioned to create, challenges to it. But one of the things that I do think is effective is, the book is called From Allyship to Coalition, because I reject the notion of allyship as it currently is expressed in kind of liberal, mainstream anti-racism. I find it problematic for all sorts of reasons that I expand on in the book. But coalition, to me, solidarity is subversive. What I say about allyship is that allyship offers charity at the expense of solidarity. It is solidarity that is subversive. Division actually isn't subversive. Race was created to ensure division. When you look at somebody like Fred Hampton, who I talk about in the book, and the fact that, in the 1960s, he had the vision to create this rainbow coalition, between the Black Panthers, the Young Patriots, and the Young Lords. The fact that he could attempt to work in coalition with these Southern disenfranchised whites who had like the Confederate flag as their symbol, they seem like very, very unlikely bedfellows. But he could see that while, of course, the Young Patriots did not experience racism, they're white people, they did experience police brutality, and they did experience diminished life opportunities as a result of the inequalities perpetuated by capitalism. So by identifying, those shared goals, the idea was to build this coalition that brings on board so many people who identify shared interests, that you can create a mass movement that, that encompasses so many people that it cannot be ignored, So I really think solidarity is subversive.
If you're not willing to be John Brown as a white person, and I'm not saying that you need to plan a whole ass and uprising, but that needs to be your energy, because that's what coalition looks like. That's what true putting down that whiteness looks like. The book is called What White People Can Do Next, From Allyship to Coalition. Drew McCaskill is here as well. And I asked you a question off mic that I'm gonna bring on mic. Those of us, I struggle every day because I believe that people have more in common than they do differences. And the struggle is, how do I bring people together at the same time, empower folk who have been oppressed by a system that was designed to oppress them, at the same time, not make people feel guilty and bad, but yeah, you're tied to this whiteness. And so maybe you should feel guilty and bad. I don't know. How do we navigate these spaces to get to a place of freedom for everybody and happiness and peace for everybody?
So I think honesty, like in What White People Can Do Next, I have, I should know this off the top of my head, but I do not. I have maybe like 8, it's divided into 8 or 9 different like headings as to what needs to happen. And the first one is understanding coalition, but the second one is stop the denial. So we really have to have a truthful reckoning and just base level understanding of the fact that whiteness was invented and the work that whiteness was invented to do, which was to enshrine this idea of white superiority and to justify the subjugation of Black people. We have to just have that. You cannot react to that history with this like violent denial, that has to be the base level. But with that being said, I think my 4th or 5th heading is abandon guilt, because I also don't feel that people are, so you are not responsible for what your ancestors did, but you are responsible for what you do. So you don't need to feel guilt. We have been born into this system. It's something that's bequeathed to us centuries before we were born. So we can't feel guilty for that, but you can feel guilty about what you do. You have responsibility for what you do. So there's no point, this kind of liberal hand-wringing and self-flagellation and allyship that comes from a place of trying to assuage your guilt or trying to make you feel better. Action that is coming from that motivation is about making you feel better. It's not about doing the necessary work that needs to happen to change things in the way they so urgently need to be changed. So stopping the denial, but also abandoning guilt, I think are two things that are key.